It's my pleasure now to introduce Denis Alexander, who is delivering the first talk in this seminar. I will make a presentation in Spanish, so I guess your colleagues know you already, but I will try to make it short, read short lines, so that everybody knows about your trajectory. Bien, Denis Alexander es doctor en neuroquímica por el Institute of Psychiatry de Londres, es director emérito del Faraday Institute for Science and Religion y fellow del St. Edmund's College de la Universidad de Cambridge. Entre 1992 y 2013 fue editor de la revista Science and Christian Belief. Actualmente es miembro del National Committee of Christians in Science y del Comité Ejecutivo de la International Society for Science and Religion. Estará a cargo de la primera exposición y le damos ahora la palabra. So I invite you, Denis, to come to the fore. Yes, you can do as much as 45, 55 minutes if you need.
Until 10, if we need.
Okay. Until 11. That's right.
Good. Well, thank you very much. Now, is this on? Is the sound okay? Is it switched on?
Not
It's
yet.
got a light on it.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, I shall press that button.
Another, again?
Okay, and again.
Once more?
And again. There we are.
That's
green. Sounds good? Yeah. Excellent. Good. Thank you very much for your welcome, and it's really wonderful to be here. And it's a great privilege for us, really, to come here from the Faraday Institute and join in this conference for 2 days. And personally, I'm really looking forward to the interactions, the questions, the discussion, and I think it's going to be a really interesting time. So this morning then we come to a very kind of general talk. This is like one of these very general lectures. You know, it's often the case to start off a conference in this way. And we want to think about the kind of models that people are using these days to think about science and religion. How do they interrelate with each other? I think one of the great truths about scientists is they love to build models. We all love to build models. And those of us here in the sciences are very well aware that if we have raw data, if we just have basic data, it's very difficult to publish that. What you need is a story, you need a model, you need something that makes your data coherent and brings it together. And so we love our models in order to get our story hopefully into a good journal. Now, of course, when we think about models in science, we think about things like, you know, the double helix, and as, well, I can remember, you probably may not, I will remember back in the 50s, there were many rival models for the structure of DNA, and so we have here the triple helix model of Linus Pauling, we had then the double helix model of course, Watson and Crick, and there were a number of other ideas going around. And so, as we all know, eventually it was the double helix model that won the day. Everyone today knows that DNA is a double helix and not a triple helix. Although, actually in the laboratory, you can make DNA into a triple helix, but that's another story. But generally speaking, it's the double helix model that everybody agrees about. So in science, it's quite possible to have models that everybody agrees on. Now, of course, when we come to the humanities, things get a lot more complicated. And that's, of course, because especially we're investigating these broader meta-scientific questions. Historically, of course, there is no such thing as science, in the sense that science is some fixed, static idea that's the same now as it has been for centuries. Science today in 2014 is clearly not the same as science in the 17th century and so on. And so we have to think, first of all, even about the meaning of science and, of course, the meaning of religion if we're going to have some discussion between science and religion. And if you look at science today, even the way we do science varies very widely in the different disciplines. I mean, somebody speculating about string theory in the mathematical physics, I mean, that is thousands of kilometers away from from the kind of stuff I do in the biomedical sciences. I think we may have lost the picture there. I might have to reboot. That's interesting. It's when I mentioned the word physics, things went badly wrong. It's physics. Maybe I mentioned the word biology. I think that just needs probably... Well, the green light is flashing. I'll keep talking until the next slide comes on. That's no problem at all. Now, another challenge about science, of course, is it doesn't even mean the same in different languages. I mean, science in English is actually rather unique because, you know, when we talk about science in English, we really are talking about contemporary, empirical, experimental science, the kind of science that goes on in laboratories down the road here and so on. That's what we mean in English. If you really look at science and the word in nearly all the other languages of the world, as far as I know, it has a much more general meaning. It means Wissenschaft. It means this sense of any body of constructed academic knowledge. You can tell me if my feeling is in Spanish, Ciencias, it's also got this broader meaning. Perhaps you can tell me later if that's the case. Certainly I know in French, which I speak, la science is like Wissenschaft, very broad meaning. Bilim in Turkish, which I also speak actually, has this broader meaning, ilim in Arabic and so on. So that's also a root of some confusion actually, that we're not always talking about the same thing when we're talking about science. Of course, if you've gone to somebody in Cambridge back in the 17th century, let's say you've gone up to Isaac Newton, said to Isaac Newton, what is the relationship between science and religion? Newton would have looked puzzled. What do you mean? Because, of course, in those days, the theology was the queen of the sciences, and so there was no separation, really, sharp separation between natural philosophy, as science was called, and between theology. It was all part of one great body of investigation. And even in English, anyway, the names for those who do science has changed historically. They were always called natural philosophers before about the 1870s. Charles Darwin called himself a natural philosopher. He was not a scientist. It was only really in the late 19th century that people began to call themselves scientists. The word scientist was invented by a priest of the Anglican Church. He was William Whewell. He was the master of Trinity College, and he invented the word in 1834. Actually, English people did not like the word scientist. It was exported to America. So in America, people started calling themselves scientists, and so later on, people thought, ooh, it's one of these American words we don't want in England. So therefore, it took some time to actually become in common usage in Britain. Now, the name changed then, and the understanding changed, and then when we go and look at religion, obviously, then we are in a whole different area where there is no entity as religion. There are just thousands of different religions, as we all know, and thousands of different belief systems. And according to the editors of the World Christian Encyclopedia, there are 19 major religions. We can subdivide those into 270 large religious groups, and then thousands of small religious groups, including an amazing 34,000 distinct Christian groups. I don't know how they get this number of 34,000, but you know, there's a huge variety, even within the Christian community. There's just a huge variation, and the same, of course, is true in the Islamic world, and so on. So how do we go about a discussion between science and religion when there is so much variety? So one position would be to say, well, we shouldn't have any models at all. Models are misleading. We should simply describe the complexity. The relationships are going to be very complex. So therefore, talking about models is not really appropriate because it's simplifying something that's really very complicated. And I have a lot of sympathy with that view. I think clearly it is complex and we need to describe the complexity. At the same time, life is short. We don't, all of us, have a huge amount of time to describe all that complexity. So I think models are useful tools to help us to think about the relationship. And so what I want to do then is to introduce 4 basic models for relating science and religion, at the same time being very aware that these will oversimplify complex questions. Now, what I'm going to do today is really talk about science in the modern empirically based science meaning, so the science that's being done in the neurobiology laboratory down the road, that sort of science. And I'm going to be talking about the Christian faith. So I'm not going to be talking about other religions, where life generally gets even more complicated. Let's just stick with those 2 aspects, science and religion. Now, there are 4 models I'm going to talk about. So I'll just put this slide up, and then I'm going to talk about each of them in a little more detail. We have the conflict model, we have the kind of separation model, we have what I'm going to call fusion models, I will explain in a moment, and then we have what I will call a complementary model. And so I'm just going to work through those one by one. Now, of course, in the English-speaking world, we have plenty of representatives of the conflict model. Here is a quotation from John Worrell. He's a philosopher. He's in the London School of Economics, and he wrote this in a book a few years ago, and I quote, "Science and religion are in irreconcilable conflict. There is no way in which you can be both properly scientifically minded and a true religious believer." Okay. Very clear statement of the conflict model. And we note here that there are both descriptive and normative elements in this assertion. In other words, he thinks he's describing sociologically what is the case and also what ought to be the case. And you will perhaps have heard of this gentleman, we'll quote from a little bit, our own Richard Dawkins from Oxford, who is a representative, of course, of the new atheism. He writes, "I pay religions the compliment of regarding them as scientific theories, and I see God as a competing explanation for facts about the universe and life." So clearly here we have a narrative of conflict. He's trying to say that every kind of religious statement is in some kind of competition with scientific statements, and that's a very common position that we find amongst the new atheists. And here's just one other example of, in this case, the late Francis Crick, writing The Astonishing Hypothesis. He says that the astonishing hypothesis is that you, your joys and your sorrows, whoa, there we go. Okay, I'll start that one again. The astonishing hypothesis is that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. So the classic position of the ultra-reductionist, trying to say that all of these aspects of our human personality are no more than, the firing of synapses in our brain and their associated molecules. So here we have a rather triumphalist view of science, an ultra-reductionist view of science, a claim that science is the only valid form of knowledge. It potentially has the power to explain everything. Science is in conflict with religion, and that's seen somehow as a rival enterprise to science. So that's quite a common idea in our contemporary world. Now, the conflict thesis, of course, is also sustained by certain segments of the Christian community, in this case, the young earth creationists. And in a moment, you'll just see a picture of they have some sort of museum in Kansas where you can come and see, people riding on dinosaurs, that kind of thing. So here's a real rejection of contemporary science, a rejection of Darwinism. And obviously, this tends to create a conflict because then people start thinking that this is the normal, this is some sort of Christian idea, and this is a normal Christian idea. I realize that creationism in Argentina is very, very, very small, probably. We were just talking about that. But of course, in the United States, it's big. 44% of the American population reject the theory of evolution. Amazing. 44%. So, this inevitably brings this conflict thesis. It keeps it alive. Now, I actually think that you need probably both extremes, in both opposite poles in a discussion. They both kind of need each other to keep the conflict model going. So, and often they perhaps more similar to each other than they would like to admit. So in the British press, Richard Dawkins is often called a fundamentalist, a sort of atheistic fundamentalist. And of course, creationists are often blamed in the same way. And perhaps they need each other for their own kind of rhetoric, their own narrative, their own stories to kind of ideologically keep alive. Anyway, whatever the reason, there they are, and they help to sustain the conflict model. So it's a sociological fact. We have to cope with it. And it's kept alive by the scientists who claim too much for their science, and by religious believers who claim too much for their theology. I would want to suggest also that the conflict model is kept alive by religious believers who are opposed to advances in science which have major ethical implications. And this is another area of conflict that we're familiar with, especially when it comes to reproductive technologies, in vitro fertilization, and so on and so on. And so the impression, although there may be good reasons for the church to critique these new advances, the impression sometimes given in the scientific community is that this is just something that the church always does, is to oppose new things, and so that can be an impression. Now, before we go on and look at some of the other models, let's just spend a little bit of time in a kind of critique. Why is the conflict model really implausible as a way of describing the contemporary relationship between science and religion? We have said that sociologically it's a fact, but that doesn't mean to say it's a valid model, of course. I think, firstly, I would want to make three critiques. The first is clearly misunderstandings about what people are saying. So I think religious people often can misunderstand what scientists are saying. Certainly, scientists can misunderstand what religious people are saying, and so there's a real lack of communication here, and we need people to mediate that communication. We need scientists in this field to write popular books for people in the general public. Now, we do need a slide, but I'm going to just describe it for you. Okay, so Rodney Stark. Rodney Stark is an American sociologist of religion. You may have read his books. He's done an interesting study. He wrote a book called For the Glory of God, Princeton University Press, 2003. And he included a sociological survey of the main natural philosophers between the years 1543 to 1680. 1543 to 1680. And what he wanted to find out was, what was their religious sort of position? How can we describe them religiously? As a sociologist, he's just doing this as a sociologist. And so he accepted into his list, he did a whole survey of the secondary literature, and he came up with a total of 52 natural philosophers who had really made a big difference to their fields. These are the star natural philosophers. These are really good ones. Okay. And he looked at their denomination. He found that out of these 52, 26 were Catholic and 26 were Protestant. Very convenient, that's good. Europe at the time was, of course, about 50-50 Protestant Catholic, I guess, at that time. He found that out of the 52, 15 had ecclesiastical careers. They were monks, they were priests, something like that, so they were full-time religious people. But maybe most interesting of all was his kind of analysis of their religious commitment. So he divided them into three groups. Either those who were very devout, I mean, there was clearly from their writings that they had very strong religious commitments, or secondly, they were conventionally religious. They were sort of not anti-religious, but there was nothing in their writings that would show they were especially religious. And then there were skeptics, what he called skeptics. So what's interesting is that in his devout group, there was 62%. 62% was the devout group, 35% were conventionally religious, and he could only find two people who were skeptics. One of those was Edmund Halley. Halley's comment, I don't know if it comes around here, but Edmund Halley was probably an atheist, but a very rare, atheists in those days were very rare species, extremely rare species. So I think it's interesting that if you really look at the roots of the science that we practice today, the roots are back there in the early modern period, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, and really we see there a very positive correlation between committed religious belief and energetic science and successful science. And I'm going to overgeneralize here a very complex story. I know some of you here are experts in this field, but as we go through, we find, certainly in the English-speaking world, we find that natural theology and science are first cousins, they're friendly, they're cooperating together right up into the latter part of the 19th century. And then the late 19th century, we get the professionalization of science, and science and religion, in the English-speaking world anyway, begin to go their separate ways. So really the separation between science and faith really took some time, but it happened, I think, or historians think, mostly through the professionalization of science. It wasn't really Darwin. I think that's a mistake. Darwin was actually accepted by the Anglican Church very quickly after the publication of The Origin of Species. Darwin was being taught in my university by 1865. If you look at the exam papers for the natural sciences in Cambridge in the mid-1860s, there are questions there about Mr. Darwin and discuss Mr. Darwin's theory and so on, assuming the truth of the theory. And remember, at that time, all the teaching in Cambridge University was given by clerics of the Church of England. So it's a mistake, I think, to think that Darwinism was somehow the cause of the conflict model, the conflict idea. I think the conflict idea came out of professionalization, where the science that used to be done by religious people was now done by professionals, and so on and so forth. And so today, no historian of science takes the conflict thesis seriously as an overall model to describe the historical relationship between science and religion. I will read you a quotation here. This is from Stephen Shapin from his book, The Scientific Revolution, University of Chicago Press. He writes, and I quote, "In the late Victorian period, it was common to write about the warfare between science and religion, and to presume that these two bodies of culture must always have been in conflict. However, it has been a very long time since these attitudes have been held by historians of science." And I think historians of science have done us a huge service in deconstructing the conflict model and really opening up a much more complex relationship, which is really much more interesting and much more persuasive. So, those are two critiques. The first critique of the conflict model is that it claims that people are claiming too much, there's a lack of understanding between the communities. The second critique is that it doesn't fit well with the history of philosophy of science. The third critique one can make is by simply looking at the present religious composition of the scientific community. And when you look at that, you know, it simply looks like the average general public, if you like. You know, there's nothing that suggests there's anything about being a religious believer that prevents you going into science. In fact, there's some evidence of the opposite way, that it might be stimulating people to go into science. There was a famous questionnaire done by an American psychologist in 1916 called James Luber. And James Luber decided to do a random questionnaire of the scientific community at that time in America. And he randomly picked names out of an encyclopedia called the American Men of Science. And he asked them a very straightforward question. Basically, do you believe in a personal God who answers prayer? In other words, quite a theological question. At that time, this is 1916, at that time, 42% said yes. 42% said yes. So in 1996, there were two historians, Ed Larson and Larry Whittam, and they decided to repeat this questionnaire. They thought that'd be interesting, because James Luber had predicted that as science education in America increases, so the level of religious belief in the scientific community would go down. That was his prediction. So here's a good way of testing the prediction. 1996, 80 years later. So they did the same questionnaire. They asked the same question. They used the same encyclopedia, randomly distributed names. The book, I'm happy to say, is now called The American Men and Women of Science, 1996. But at this time now, 39.3% say yes. 39 is the same percentage. Around 40% say yes, we do believe in a personal God who answers prayer. So I think that's quite interesting. That seems to suggest that although the influence of science and public education of science in America has increased hugely during the 20th century, the level of belief in a God who answers prayer has actually stayed pretty stable, during the course of the 20th century. In Cambridge, I could certainly give you the names of just many professors in the science faculties, the science departments, who are committed Christian believers or religious believers, members of another faith. And it's quite striking, actually. There are far more in the scientific departments than in the humanities. It'd be interesting in the discussion to find out the situation here in Argentina, but certainly in Cambridge, anyway, relatively few religious believers in the humanities, far more in the scientific community. So whatever the reasons for that, at least gives no evidence there's some lack of compatibility between religion and science, or between being a religious believer and going into the sciences. So those are the three main criticisms I would make of the conflict model. Let's move on now. Let's move on and think about model number 2, which is, I'm going to call it the separation model. The separation model. Quite obviously, science is over here doing its work, answering its questions. Religion is over here, answering its kind of questions, and they're just separate. And this was the position presented by the late Stephen Jay Gould, professor of paleontology at Harvard University, who talked about this view as the non-overlapping magisteria, that somehow science covers the magisterium of the empirical realm. What is the universe made of? It's about facts, and so forth. And the magisterium of religion, in his view, goes over questions of ultimate meaning and moral value. And so he was quite influential, I think, in this particular view. Now, there's a lot of positive things to say about this model, because, for example, religion and science are asking different kinds of questions. There's no doubt about that. And so that's an important point. Also, if science does its work over here and religion does its work over there, then there won't be any conflict. They won't talk to each other. So, it makes for a quiet life. You want a quiet life, you just kind of keep everything separate. The problem, though, is that life is much more complex than the separation model might suggest. And again, I want to give you three kind of criticisms of the separation model. And the first is, again, historical. I mean, if we look at history, we just see a constant traffic of ideas going to and fro between science and faith. And that simply doesn't support the idea that they're living in separate compartments. I don't know if you ever read the essays by Stephen Jay Gould, who used to write wonderful books of essays, many of them on biology, on the history of science, quite popular, but very well researched. And what's ironic is that many of his essays demonstrate how religion played a big role in the formation of natural philosophers in earlier centuries. And he has some very nice examples of that. So ironically, Gould himself undermined his own model. And then secondly, although it's true that science and religion are asking distinct questions about reality, nevertheless, it's the same reality that's being addressed in both cases. So we'll be hearing later on about the brain and about pain and about the biology of human personhood. But, religion has a lot to say about human personhood as well. And it's the same individual that religion is looking at. It's simply asking rather different kinds of questions. We'll come back to that point in a moment in the final model. The other point, I think, is that, religious scientists who have a religious faith, we only have one brain. We only have one brain. Our brain is not compartmentalized into all of these different disciplines. And although we may be asking different kinds of questions, still it's the same reality and it's the same brain, the same mind, which is both investigating religion and investigating science. And so I would see that as a critique of the separation model. And in fact, we find quite a lot of scientists who find that their science raises religious questions for them. There's a cosmologist called Paul Davies, Professor Paul Davies, a friend of mine. He's written many good books on popular science and so on. And he has been really forced by the data into thinking there must be something going on. He's not a religious believer. He doesn't believe in a personal God. But he recognizes that his science is raising questions such as the fine-tuning of the universe, the anthropic principle, and so on, which are difficult. It's difficult to be an atheist. It's really hard for him to be an atheist. There's something going on here. There's some intelligence in the universe. Something's happening there. He doesn't know what it is. And so that, again, I think, is a kind of critique of the separation model, because many scientists find that their science makes them ask big questions, makes them ask theological questions, and so on. Okay, third model. We're going to think a little bit about the fusion models. The reason I call them fusion models, plural, is because here they tend to take information from science and use it to build a religious system, or they take information from religion and use it to critique science in some way. In some way they try and fuse science and religious language together. And basically the idea here is that scientific and religious knowledge belong to the same domain. Some years ago, there were a number of writers who tried to do this with quantum physics. You get books, I don't know if you've come across books by Fritjof Capra, Tower physics. There's quite a lot of these books which are trying to say in quantum physics somehow there's a synergy here, there's a relationship with Eastern mysticism, and in some way quantum mechanics supports these mystical ways of thinking. And so here you have a kind of fusion of religious and scientific ideas going on. You find it, of course, in a completely different way amongst the creationists. In this case, they're saying Genesis 1 to 3 is like a scientific textbook, and this is our religious narrative, and therefore we're going to talk about creation science. So you get American creationists talking about creation science as if there's some sort of fusion going on here between scientific ideas and theological ideas and so on. I think I would want to say that Teilhard de Chardin actually has some elements of a fusion model, because he was taking Lamarckian evolution and using Lamarckian evolution to generate theological ideas or to emphasize theological ideas. So I think some aspects of Theology would be probably under this umbrella. So there are many kinds of fusion models. So, as with the other models, I'd like to maybe make a few suggestions why there can be problems with these kinds of models. I think it tends to lead to some confusion when you mix religious and scientific language, because each discipline clearly has its own integrity, it has its own definitions of meanings of words and so on. And so it kind of also undermines the idea that people of any faith or none can cooperate in the scientific enterprise. Because it's putting a kind of ideological investment in science. And science changes all the time. The science of today will be very different from the science of 10 years' time and so on. So there's a constant movement here. So if you have a kind of religious investment in a scientific idea, then it becomes more difficult to assess that idea purely on scientific grounds. That's quite difficult to do. And so I think that's a worry about the fusion models there. And another worry is simply that if you invest in today's science, then unfortunately, as I say, science moves on, and so tomorrow you can find your religious system collapses, or religious ideas collapse, because today's science is tomorrow's leftovers, we say. It's like, you know, it'll be out of date, and therefore your religious system will be out of date as well. And what I can see on my screen, but what you can't see on your screen, is pictures of houses on the edge of cliffs where the waves have come in and undermined the house and they're collapsing down into the sea. Okay, that's trying to make the point, you know, that if you build a religious system on scientific ideas, then pretty soon your house is going to collapse because of the transient nature of scientific discovery. Okay, now this is the fourth model we're going to look at, and we're going to call it the complementarity model. So let's imagine that this book of life, this reality, everything that exists, is like a cube. Okay, we have a cube, and then we're going to slice the cube down different layers. Okay, we have different layers going on here, different levels, and each level represents one particular way of understanding the world. So we have all our different disciplines, and each level is going to be one level. It's going to be one way of understanding the world. So clearly we have our scientific understanding of the world. It's asking questions about what is the mechanism, what are the general properties of matter, are there scientific laws that we can make here, and so on. All the kind of typical scientific questions. Then we have an ethical level of understanding of the world, and we're asking a different set of questions. We're asking the question, what ought I to do with my life? What ought I to do with these new scientific data and discoveries, and so on and so on. The whole level of ethical discourse. It's very distinct. It's distinct from scientific discourse. Then, of course, we have the whole level of aesthetic understanding of the world. What counts as beauty in the world? How do I count beauty in a poem or in a novel or some of the work of drama, perhaps, and so on? The whole aesthetic discourse. Then we have our own personal level of understanding the world, which is unique to us. We have our own personal biographies. And this is another level of real information. This is genuine knowledge. We know that knowledge, but we're the only person who knows it because it's our own particular experience of the world. And so on. And then we have a religious level of understanding of the world, where we're asking questions, why is there a universe anyway? What breathes fire into the equations? Does life have any purpose and meaning? Is there a God? And so on. All the great philosophical, religious questions, we have that as another level. So you get the idea. So we need all these narratives to do justice to this complex reality that we call life. And these are all complementary narratives. I mean, it would be a bit silly to say one is in rivalry with another one. They're not rivals to each other. They're not in conflict with each other. They are complementary narratives, and we need them all to do justice to the reality around us. And of course, it's the way in which our university is organized. We organize our university, of course, into departments and faculties, and each particular discipline has its own particular way of justifying its beliefs. Historians do not justify their beliefs in exactly the same way as scientists, although there's some relationship. And the same for the law faculty, or English, or languages, or something else. So every department has its own particular way of looking at the world. And of course, the problem then comes if somebody wants to say that my level of understanding is the only one that counts. That's where the problems begin. And often, I'm afraid, it is reductionist scientists who want to make that kind of claim. Now, if you picture a cube and you picture different levels, it's also good to put arrows going up and down between the levels, because clearly all these disciplines are linked up, they integrate with each other in interesting kinds of ways, but they are still distinct ways of looking at the world. And actually, I think most scientists, not all, but most scientists are complementarians, really, in the way that they understand the world. I have a quotation here from Lord Martin Rees. He was president of the Royal Society in London, and he's retired now, and he was also master of Trinity College in Cambridge. And he says this, he says that, and he's an atheist, by the way, he's an atheist. He says, the preeminent mystery is why anything exists at all. What breathes life into the equations and actualize them in a real cosmos? Such questions lie beyond science. They are the province of philosophers and theologians. In other words, Rees is saying, look, science is great at answering scientific questions, but these big meta-scientific questions, they lie beyond science. They are the area of philosophers and theologians. It might seem very obvious, but I think it's encouraging that here is a leading scientist who is basically a complementarian, saying we need other narratives to help us explain the world. And if we come back and look at Francis Crick, I gave that quotation before, from The Astonishing Hypothesis. You remember the quotation from Francis Crick where he says, you, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. And it's that little phrase, no more than, which of course tells us that here we have ontological reductionism, the idea that there is nothing more to say once you have given that description of neurons and synapses and brain description. That's ontological reductionism, very different from methodological reductionism, which of course is what we use in the laboratory as scientists all the time, where if you want to find out how something works, you take it to bits. You look at the pieces, obviously, that's how you do it, and then you see how they form again. That methodological reductionism is very different from ontological reductionism, and it's very important to make the distinction between those two philosophies. Now, in fact, in English, the word nothing but is often used for the ontological reductionist, and you can read that all over the place, especially in the New Atheists. It's nothing but. In fact, there's a wonderful phrase, sometimes we call it nothing buttery. Okay? Nothing buttery is those ontological reductionists who keep saying nothing but. Okay? Maybe that doesn't work in Spanish, I don't know, but anyway. And in the case of the brain, I think the brain, sorry, no picture, but in the case of the brain, it's a wonderful example of complementary narratives. Because here we have really three narratives. Thinking about brain, mind, and sociology, we have the brain description. I'm describing your brain in terms of its neuronal structure and so on and so forth. But then I have my own language, the I language, the language of mind. So the it language, the language of brain description, the I language is complementary, I would want to say. The I language is the language of mind. And then we have the social language of personal biography, where we have personal relationships. Those are three very tightly integrated, but very distinct narratives. They're all complementary narratives with each other. We need them all to do justice to the complexity of human personhood. So that's just another example of complementarity. I think also the Christian doctrine of creation provides another interesting example of complementarity. It's claiming that here we have one great dualism, if you like. We have a dualism between God and everything that exists. Okay, so everything that exists apart from God has only come into existence because God has brought it into existence. And so clearly, what are scientists doing? Well, scientists are describing what God does in the created order to the best of our ability. And so we talk about God as the primary cause, we talk about secondary causes, we talk about scientific investigation being a study of those secondary causes that God uses to bring about his purposes on this earth. And so these are complementary narratives. The language of creation is a different kind of understanding. It's a complementary narrative to the scientist who is investigating those secondary causes. And the same comes in the thinking about the relationship between evolution and creation, that clearly creation is asking the question about biological diversity. What is it about? What's the reason for biological diversity? What's the big why question and why it's there and so on? Those are the theological questions. In biology, we're answering different kinds of questions. We're answering the question, well, how does it work? What mechanisms does God use to bring about biological diversity on this planet and so on? Here we have two complementary narratives again. And this, of course, undermines this old God of the gaps kind of idea completely. I'm sure you're familiar with this idea. Here we have a great kind of block of scientific knowledge, but it's full of holes. We have great gaps in our scientific knowledge. So, what do we do about those gaps? The temptation for some atheists, and also for some religious believers, is then to invoke God as somehow in the mystery. God is put somehow in the mysterious gaps in our scientific knowledge. And, of course, there's great danger in doing that because, first of all, the gaps will close. Science is a successful enterprise. It will close up those gaps. And then what happens to your concept of God, if God is located in those mysterious areas? And of course, theologically, it's very unsatisfactory because if we are Christian believers, we believe in a God who is a creator, then we believe in a God who is the ground of all existence. Everything exists as part of the created order. Everything is part of that creation. And so the gaps, the current gaps in our scientific knowledge are irrelevant theologically or philosophically. They make no difference at all. It simply means we should write another grant to do another project, get more people in the lab to fill up the gaps. That's the task of science to do. So the understanding then of creation helps us to undermine, I think, that God of the gaps and so on. Okay, so today we have looked at four models, and I'm going to finish, and again I'm going to I have to picture those four models you saw at the beginning up on the screen. And what's sort of interesting is that if you want to put historical names on each of the four models, it's quite easy to find historical names for the conflict model, at least up into the 19th century. You really begin to get conflict at the end of the 19th century. You might want to put Galileo in there, but that's a special case. We'll leave Galileo for another day. You could easily find names for the fusion models. You can find names for the complementarity models. Where you cannot find names to put on the model in historical terms is the separation model. There really are. You just don't find, it's very hard to find people in the history of philosophy of science who completely separated science and religion. You just don't usually see that. There may be one or two candidates, but they're quite hard to find. And so I think from my point of view, out of these various models, I find, I suppose, the complementarity model the most useful. It does the most work for me. It's not perfect, it doesn't answer all our questions. There are genuine conflicts between science and religion. They exist, so we mustn't sort of cover those up. But the complementarity model, I think, is a good way into this discussion, and I hope that we'll see that over the next few days. Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry you didn't have pictures. There we go. Satisfied. Okay, thank you.